Have you ever noticed the kindest people rarely explode without a reason? They don't argue over every little thing. They don't seek revenge. They don't fight for attention. Instead, they give another chance, and another, until one day, they disappear. No warning, no shouting, no dramatic goodbye, just silence. Most people call it cold, but that's not what it is. Because what you're witnessing isn't anger. It's something much more permanent. It's the moment a person realizes that continuing to care is costing them more than letting go. And here's the strange part. Almost nobody recognizes the signs until it's already too late. People assume patience has no limit. They mistake forgiveness for weakness. They confuse understanding with endless tolerance. But patience isn't infinite. It's an investment. Every ignored boundary, every broken promise, every conversation where one person gives everything while the other gives almost nothing, withdraws from that investment, little by little, until eventually the account reaches zero. Today's conversation isn't about becoming tougher. It isn't about becoming colder. And it certainly isn't about encouraging people to walk away from everyone who disappoints them. It's about understanding the hidden psychological process that happens inside people who spend years placing everyone else's emotions ahead of their own. Because the final stage of patience doesn't begin with anger. It begins with clarity, a quiet realization that changes the way someone sees every relationship around them. When that realization arrives, their behavior changes, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started caring about themselves. You'll notice they explain less. They stop defending themselves. They stop chasing people who have already decided not to understand them. They become quieter, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've learned that not everyone is listening. This shift often surprises the people around them. The same people who once depended on endless understanding suddenly wonder, what happened? The truth is, nothing happened overnight. This decision was being built for months, sometimes years. Every dismissed feeling, every broken expectation, every moment they convinced themselves to just be patient one more time, until eventually, one more time became the last time. Here's what makes this stage so powerful. It doesn't come with rage, it comes with peace. Because once someone accepts that they cannot force respect, honesty, or effort from another person, the struggle ends. And with it, the emotional exhaustion that kept them trapped. Ironically, this is often the moment people begin trying to repair the relationship, not because the situation changed, but because the energy changed. People notice when someone is no longer chasing approval. They notice when emotional reactions disappear. They notice when their usual methods no longer produce guilt, arguments, or explanations. What they're seeing isn't emotional distance. They're witnessing emotional independence. And that changes every interaction. Throughout this talk, we're going to explore the subtle signs that patience is reaching its final stage, why emotionally generous people often stay far longer than they should, the invisible habits that slowly drain resilience, and the mindset that allows someone to leave without hatred, resentment, or revenge. Because the most misunderstood ending isn't the loud one, it's the quiet one. The moment someone realizes, peace is no longer found in holding on, it's found in finally letting go. Most people believe that relationships end because of one big moment. They imagine a dramatic argument, a shocking betrayal, or a single mistake so painful that it changes everything overnight. But that's rarely how emotionally generous people reach the point of leaving. More often, the ending begins quietly, almost invisibly. It starts with small moments that seem insignificant on their own. A forgotten promise, a dismissed feeling, a conversation where one person speaks while the other merely waits for their turn to respond. None of these moments appears large enough to destroy a relationship. Yet together, they create something much heavier than any single event could ever accomplish. People who naturally care deeply about others often give more chances than most realize. They have an incredible ability to understand why someone acted the way they did. They look beyond behavior and search for reasons. Maybe the other person is stressed. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they're carrying pain that no one else can see. This willingness to understand is one of their greatest strengths. but it can also become the very thing that keeps them trapped in situations that slowly drain their emotional energy. When someone constantly explains away another person's behavior, they begin making exceptions that they would never make for themselves. They convince themselves that tomorrow will be different. They believe that one more conversation will finally create understanding. They hope that one more act of kindness will inspire appreciation. That hope is powerful because it feels compassionate. Yet hope, when unsupported by change, can quietly become a reason to tolerate what should never become normal. The difficult truth is that people don't usually become emotionally exhausted because they care too much. They become exhausted because their care is never matched. Every healthy relationship depends on a rhythm of giving and receiving. It doesn't have to be perfectly equal every single day. Life doesn't work that way. Sometimes one person carries more of the weight because the other is struggling. That's completely normal. The problem begins when that imbalance stops being temporary and starts becoming the foundation of the relationship itself. Imagine carrying a bucket that loses a few drops of water every hour. At first, you barely notice it. The bucket still feels full enough to be useful. But if no one ever refills it, eventually those tiny losses become impossible to ignore. Emotional energy works much the same way. Every ignored feeling, every broken promise, every moment of feeling unseen removes a little more from that reserve. None of these experiences seems devastating alone. Together, they slowly empty what once felt endless. What's fascinating is that this process is often invisible to everyone except the person experiencing it. The people around them continue living as though nothing has changed. They assume everything is fine because there hasn't been an argument. They mistake silence for acceptance. They interpret patience as proof that their behavior carries no consequences. In reality, silence is sometimes the sound of someone quietly measuring whether the relationship still feels safe, respectful, and worth protecting. There comes a point where something inside begins to shift. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's simply the moment when hope starts asking for evidence instead of promises. Instead of believing words automatically, they begin watching actions more carefully. Instead of asking, "What did they mean?" they begin asking, "What are they consistently showing me?" That small change in perspective can transform everything because patterns reveal truths that isolated moments often hide. Human behavior is remarkably consistent over time. Anyone can apologize once. Anyone can promise to improve during an emotional conversation. Lasting change, however, is measured by repetition. It appears in everyday choices, in small acts of respect, in reliability, and in the willingness to take responsibility without being reminded. When those patterns never appear, even the most patient person begins recognizing that they aren't waiting for change anymore. They're waiting for a version of someone that may never exist. Another reason this process goes unnoticed is because emotionally generous people rarely announce every disappointment. Instead of reacting immediately, they often process it internally. They tell themselves it isn't worth creating conflict. They choose peace over confrontation. Ironically, that desire to protect the relationship can prevent necessary conversations from happening early, allowing unhealthy patterns to continue unchecked. Over time, something remarkable happens. The emotional reactions become smaller. Not because the hurt has disappeared, but because expectations have changed. Disappointment becomes familiar. Familiarity creates distance. Distance creates clarity. And clarity has a way of removing illusions that hope once protected. The person who once waited excitedly for effort now simply observes whether effort exists at all. That shift is subtle, but it marks the beginning of emotional independence. People often assume that the final decision to leave happens on the day someone walks away. In reality, that decision may have been made emotionally weeks or even months earlier. By the time the goodbye arrives, most of the grieving has already taken place internally. They have already wrestled with guilt. They have already questioned themselves. They have already replayed conversations, searched for solutions, and imagined better outcomes. Walking away is often the last step in a process that began long before anyone else noticed. This is why attempts to repair the relationship sometimes come too late. The other person suddenly senses the distance and promises to change immediately. While those promises may be sincere, trust is rarely rebuilt through urgency alone. Trust grows through consistency, and consistency requires time. If repeated actions created the damage, repeated actions are the only thing capable of restoring confidence. Words may reopen the conversation, but only behavior determines whether the relationship truly heals. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding is believing that someone leaves because they stopped caring. More often, they leave because they cared for so long without seeing meaningful change. Protecting their own emotional well-being eventually becomes an act of wisdom rather than rejection. They recognize that compassion should never require sacrificing their self-respect. They understand that loving someone does not mean accepting every pattern they bring into the relationship. And they realize that forgiveness and healthy boundaries can exist together. That realization changes everything. Instead of asking how much more they can endure, they begin asking what kind of life they want to build. Instead of measuring relationships by potential, they measure them by reality. They stop chasing promises and start paying attention to patterns. They stop investing endless energy into convincing someone to value them and begin investing that energy into becoming emotionally healthy themselves. The outside world may only notice the moment they quietly walk away, but the real transformation happened much earlier, in the silent decision to value consistency over hope and self-respect over endless patience. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about emotionally compassionate individuals is that if they're hurt enough, they'll make sure everyone knows it. People expect anger. They expect emotional speeches, long arguments, dramatic goodbyes, or endless attempts to prove how much pain they've experienced. But that expectation often comes from misunderstanding how emotional withdrawal actually works. Sometimes the loudest ending is not the one that changes everything. Sometimes the most permanent ending arrives without raising its voice at all. When someone has spent months, or even years, trying to preserve a relationship, they usually don't run out of love first. They run out of reasons to believe that their effort is making a difference. Every conversation they hoped would create understanding slowly becomes another reminder that the same problems continue. Every explanation feels familiar. Every apology sounds increasingly predictable because it isn't followed by meaningful change. Eventually, they realize they're no longer having new conversations. They're repeating old ones with different words. That realization creates a quiet shift inside them. Instead of reacting immediately to disappointment, they begin observing it. Instead of asking why someone keeps behaving the same way, they begin accepting that the behavior itself may already be the answer. This isn't bitterness. It isn't revenge. It's the gradual replacement of expectation with acceptance. They stop waiting for evidence that tomorrow will finally be different and begin paying attention to what today is consistently showing them. One of the most overlooked truths about human behavior is that people reveal their priorities through repetition. Words can be inspiring. Intentions can sound sincere. Promises can create hope. But habits tell a much more reliable story. When actions repeatedly contradict words, the mind eventually starts trusting what it sees more than what it hears. That transition doesn't happen overnight. It happens after enough experiences convince someone that believing actions is safer than believing promises. As this awareness grows, something else begins to change. They stop trying to convince others to understand their perspective. They realize that genuine understanding cannot be forced. If someone repeatedly dismisses feelings, ignores boundaries, or minimizes concerns, explaining those concerns 100 different ways rarely produces a different outcome. At some point, silence becomes less exhausting than repeating the same emotional conversation over and over again. This silence is often misunderstood. From the outside, it may appear as though everything has improved because there are fewer disagreements. In reality, the opposite may be happening. The arguments have disappeared because hope has begun disappearing with them. The person who once fought for the relationship is no longer trying to win every misunderstanding. They're quietly evaluating whether continuing to invest their emotional energy is healthy for them. People often mistake emotional restraint for emotional comfort. They assume that because someone isn't complaining anymore, they're satisfied. But emotional maturity sometimes looks remarkably quiet. Instead of reacting impulsively, a person begins gathering information. They notice patterns they once overlooked. They recognize behaviors they previously excused. Most importantly, they stop judging people by isolated moments and begin judging them by consistency. Consistency has a way of removing confusion. A single mistake can be forgiven. A difficult week can be understood. Everyone experiences moments where stress, frustration, or exhaustion affects their behavior. But when the same pattern repeats despite conversations, apologies, and opportunities to improve, the pattern itself becomes impossible to ignore. At that point, the question is no longer whether someone made a mistake. The question becomes whether they are willing to change the habits that created it. Once this perspective develops, emotional dependence begins fading. They stop checking their phone every few minutes, hoping for a message that restores confidence. They stop creating imaginary conversations in their mind about what they should have said differently. They stop believing that if they simply become more patient, more understanding, or more forgiving, everything will finally work out. Instead, they redirect that energy towards something they may have neglected for a long time, their own peace of mind. Peace often arrives quietly. It doesn't announce itself with excitement. It appears in ordinary moments. Sleeping without replaying yesterday's argument. Enjoying an afternoon without worrying about someone else's unpredictable reactions. Feeling comfortable without constantly seeking reassurance. These moments seem small, yet together they remind a person what emotional stability feels like. Once someone experiences that kind of peace again, protecting it becomes increasingly important. Interestingly, this is often when the other person finally notices something has changed. They sense the emotional distance. Conversations become shorter. Attempts to provoke reactions no longer have the same effect. The emotional urgency that once existed has disappeared. Naturally, they wonder what happened. They search for the moment everything changed, assuming there must have been one defining event. But there usually wasn't. The distance they noticed today was built gradually through countless experiences they overlooked yesterday. This explains why quiet departures often surprise the people left behind. They remember the absence of dramatic conflict and assume everything was stable. They don't realize that many decisions are made internally long before they're visible externally. By the time someone quietly steps away, they have often spent weeks or months processing disappointment, questioning themselves, considering alternatives, and grieving the relationship they hoped could exist. Another important truth is that walking away quietly doesn't necessarily mean someone stopped caring. In many cases, they care deeply. That's precisely why leaving is difficult. Genuine emotional investment isn't something people simply switch off. Instead, they reach a point where continuing to stay causes more emotional harm than choosing to leave. That decision isn't based on anger. It's based on recognizing that kindness should never require abandoning self-respect. Self-respect changes the way people respond to unhealthy patterns. Instead of chasing attention, they become comfortable allowing distance to reveal the truth. Instead of forcing relationships to continue, they allow effort to become mutual or allow the relationship to end naturally. They understand that healthy connections don't require one person to carry the emotional responsibility for two people indefinitely. Perhaps the most powerful part of this transformation is that it isn't driven by resentment. It's driven by clarity. Clarity removes the need to argue endlessly because reality becomes easier to accept. Clarity replaces emotional confusion with emotional confidence. It teaches that protecting your well-being isn't an act of selfishness, but an act of responsibility. It reminds you that relationships should create security, trust, and mutual respect rather than constant uncertainty. When someone reaches this point, their actions become remarkably simple. They stop pursuing people who repeatedly show indifference. They stop explaining boundaries that have already been ignored. They stop seeking validation from those unwilling to offer genuine respect. Their energy begins flowing toward people and environments where appreciation is returned instead of requested. To an outside observer, it may seem like they disappeared without warning. But from their perspective, the quiet departure wasn't sudden at all. It was the final visible step in a long internal journey. A journey where every repeated experience slowly replaced hope with understanding, and where choosing peace ultimately became more valuable than remaining in a cycle that never truly changed. One of the most underestimated parts of any healthy relationship is the role that boundaries play. Many people hear the word boundary and immediately think of walls, distance, or rejection. They imagine someone becoming cold or difficult to approach. But a healthy boundary isn't designed to push people away. It's designed to protect what allows genuine closeness to exist in the first place. Without boundaries, kindness slowly turns into obligation. Generosity turns into expectation. Patience turns into permission. And over time, even the strongest relationships begin carrying a weight they were never meant to support. Emotionally giving people often struggle with this idea because helping others feels natural to them. They don't measure every favor they do or every hour they spend listening to someone's problems. They give because they care, not because they're keeping score. That generosity creates meaningful relationships, but it also attracts people who mistake endless compassion for endless availability. There is an important difference between someone appreciating your kindness and someone expecting it. Appreciation creates gratitude. Expectation creates entitlement. When kindness becomes something others assume they will always receive, it slowly loses the respect it once inspired. This change rarely happens all at once. It develops through repeated experiences that seem insignificant when viewed individually. A message that goes unanswered until someone needs a favor. A promise that is forgotten because they assume you'll understand. A moment when your concerns are brushed aside while everyone else's emotions receive immediate attention. None of these situations may appear serious enough to cause lasting damage. Yet together they create a pattern that communicates something far more powerful than words ever could. They communicate where your needs are placed within the relationship. People often reveal their priorities without realizing it. They reveal them through consistency, through effort, through reliability, and through the attention they give when no one is reminding them to care. This is why respect cannot exist only during emotional conversations. Anyone can become attentive after conflict appears. Lasting respect is demonstrated during ordinary days, when there is no crisis demanding better behavior. It is found in remembering small promises, honoring commitments, listening without interruption, and recognizing another person's emotional reality, even when it differs from your own. One of the greatest mistakes people make is believing that understanding someone means accepting everything they do. Understanding explains behavior, but it does not excuse repeated patterns that create harm. You can recognize that someone is stressed while still expecting them to communicate honestly. You can understand that someone has experienced difficult circumstances while still believing they are responsible for how they treat others. Compassion and accountability are not opposites. Healthy relationships require both. When accountability disappears, trust begins weakening in ways that are difficult to notice at first. Trust is rarely destroyed by one dramatic event alone. More often, it fades through repeated moments where expectations are consistently unmet. Every broken commitment leaves behind a small question. Every ignored boundary creates a little more uncertainty. Over time, those questions become hesitation, and hesitation gradually replaces confidence. Once confidence disappears, relationships become emotionally exhausting because every interaction requires someone to wonder whether they can rely on what they're being told. This is why boundaries matter so deeply. They protect trust before trust reaches that breaking point. A boundary is not a demand that another person becomes perfect. It is a clear expression of what allows the relationship to remain healthy. It communicates that mutual respect is not optional but essential. It reminds both people that emotional closeness should never require sacrificing dignity or self-worth. Unfortunately, many people don't recognize a boundary until they experience its absence. They assume someone will always forgive another disappointment, because forgiveness has always been offered before. They assume another chance will always exist, because another chance has always been given. But every relationship contains invisible limits. Those limits are not signs of weakness. They are signs of emotional health. They prevent resentment from quietly replacing affection. One of the interesting things about emotionally mature individuals is that they often express boundaries calmly rather than dramatically. They don't always argue. They don't always threaten to leave. Sometimes they simply explain what they need with honesty and respect. The real question is not whether they communicated that boundary. The real question is whether anyone truly listened. When boundaries are repeatedly ignored, the message received is much stronger than the message spoken. It tells someone that their emotional well-being is negotiable while another person's convenience remains the priority. Over time, this realization changes how they invest their energy. They stop trying to persuade people to value them. Genuine respect cannot be negotiated into existence. It must be chosen willingly. Instead of repeating the same requests, they begin observing whether actions naturally reflect care. If they don't, the relationship starts revealing its true foundation. A connection built only on one person's effort cannot remain balanced forever. Something remarkable happens when a person begins honoring their own boundaries consistently. Their confidence grows quieter but stronger. They no longer feel guilty for protecting their time, their emotional energy, or their peace of mind. They become more selective about where they invest themselves. This isn't because they have become less compassionate. It's because they understand that compassion without limits eventually becomes self-neglect. Healthy relationships thrive when both people recognize that care must move in both directions. Listening should be mutual. Support should be mutual. Respect should be mutual. No relationship remains emotionally healthy if one person is expected to understand every mistake while receiving very little understanding in return. Reciprocity doesn't mean every action must be perfectly equal. It means both people are genuinely committed to each other's well-being. There is also an important psychological effect that occurs when boundaries are consistently respected. Emotional safety begins to grow. People become more honest because they know they will be heard rather than dismissed. They become more open because vulnerability no longer feels dangerous. Trust deepens because reliability replaces uncertainty. The relationship becomes a place where both individuals can express themselves without constantly worrying whether their needs will be minimized or ignored. By contrast, when boundaries are repeatedly violated, emotional openness slowly disappears. Conversations become more cautious. Feelings remain unspoken. Small disappointments accumulate because speaking about them no longer seems worthwhile. Eventually, silence begins replacing connection. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because experience has taught someone that saying it will not change the outcome. The difference between these two paths often comes down to one simple principle: whether respect is treated as a daily practice instead of an occasional response to conflict. Respect is demonstrated in ordinary interactions, in consistent behavior, and in the willingness to value another person's emotional reality, even when it requires effort or sacrifice. It is those repeated moments of consideration that strengthen trust over time. When people understand this, they stop viewing boundaries as obstacles and begin recognizing them as invitations to healthier relationships. They see that protecting emotional well-being is not about creating distance, but about preserving closeness. They realize that mutual respect is not maintained through grand gestures, but through countless small choices made every day. Those choices determine whether trust grows stronger or gradually fades, and they shape whether a relationship becomes a source of lasting security or a place where even the most patient person eventually feels compelled to quietly walk away in search of the peace that genuine respect makes possible. So, if there's one idea worth remembering, it's this: people who care deeply don't usually leave because of one terrible day. They leave after hundreds of ordinary days where they felt unheard, unseen, and emotionally alone. The final goodbye rarely begins with anger. It begins with acceptance. Acceptance that respect cannot be forced. Acceptance that effort cannot be one-sided forever. And acceptance that protecting your peace is sometimes the healthiest decision you can make. If someone in your life continues to offer patience, understanding, and compassion, don't mistake those qualities for permanence. Appreciate them while they're still being freely given. Listen before silence replaces conversation. Value consistency more than apologies, because trust is built by repeated actions, not repeated promises. And if you happen to be the person who's always carrying the emotional weight, remember this: setting boundaries isn't selfish. Choosing peace isn't weakness. Walking away from a pattern that refuses to change isn't giving up. Sometimes it's the first step toward becoming the healthiest version of yourself. Now, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever reached a point where you quietly walked away, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally realized your peace mattered too? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story may be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this message gave you a new perspective, take a moment to like the video, subscribe for more psychology and personal growth content, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next discussion. Until next time, remember this: the strongest people aren't always the loudest. Sometimes, the greatest strength is found in knowing exactly when to stop chasing what no longer values your presence, and to start building a life that values your peace.